est abattu. Et elle a signé son désastre.
Celebration is typical of the nation's joy at the end of nearly 6 years of war in Europe. It's a great day as the thankful people let loose their pent-up emotions.
They were dashing all over the place, and you were looking for somebody, and you wanted to talk to them, and it was a fantastic thing, really.
When I look round at other people, men or women, girls, apprentices, whichever, they were all just like I was. Tears were raining down their faces. It was very emotional.
The only satisfaction of victory was that the enemy's ideology had been bust forever and thrown onto the dust heap.
Russian newsreel pictures of the actual taking of Berlin have now been released. They show the climax of 8 days' fighting in the German capital. Now, at last, the Red Army battles through to the very heart of the city. Now, at last, after all the ghastly years of toil, blood, tears and sweat, the climax of total German defeat is reached with the death of Berlin.
In the battle for Berlin, the war came to an end for the Russians in a crescendo of destruction and death. For us, in the West, the last big battles had been won. Throughout our armies, the mood was one of confident anticipation. Although pockets of Germans were still stubbornly resisting, we all believed that the war was as good as over. It was just a matter of time.
We're out in Holland, a town called Lochem. I had a section of 9 men. And this chap, Dave Evans, he was a corporal, so he said that they won't get us now, Dick, will they? I said, no, Dave. I said, be careful, Dave, because he was in my section. And then when we had to attack Lochem, because it was one of the last big German towns where the Germans escaped routes. And I was ordered to attack this house, the extreme edge, and we had to go across this open field. And the first 5 men went down. Those picked off by snipers. And Dave Evans was amongst them. And that shook me more than anything.
At last, the first crack came, on May the 3rd, on the British front.
A German colonel came through the British lines bearing a letter from Field Marshal Bush, commander of German forces in the Hamburg area, asking for a peace pact. These historic pictures depict the events leading up to the formal surrender of German armed forces to Field Marshal Montgomery. Under cover of a white flag, the members of the German military delegation were conducted through the British positions.
And I remember picking up the telephone like one did many times in the day. And I presume it was the Corps headquarters, and they said that they were letting us know that there was a party waving a white flag, which looked as if there was quite important German folk amongst them, and they'd let us know as soon as they could what it was all about. So one immediately put down the phone, went round the tent that we had, which was attached to Monty's caravan, and told him that we just had this telephone call. On those occasions, his reaction was, he was always, didn't say very much, you know, he'd just say, Renner, ah, good. Well, Monty himself waited in the caravan while they were lined up. He said, get them lined up outside, and so they were lined up in order, and Joe Ewart, who spoke fluent German, was there. And Monty, he didn't say much, just said, oh, yes, now, what were they surrendering? And if I remember rightly, they said that they were surrendering the armed forces in the west on the British front to the British Army. And Monty said, well, that wasn't enough. He wanted the complete surrender. If he was going to accept anything, he couldn't take a part surrender.
In the event of their not agreeing to unconditional surrender, Monty said, I shall go on with the war and will be delighted to do so, and all your soldiers may be killed. That made the Huns think, and this is them thinking it. It didn't take them very long, and when after contacting Field Marshal Bush they came back to the tent, well, Monty told them in his own inimitable way exactly and precisely what it was all about.
Now, we've assembled here today to accept the surrender terms which have been made with a delegation from the German army. I will now read out the terms of that instrument of surrender. The German command agrees to the surrender of all German armed forces in Holland, in northwest Germany, including the Frisian Islands and Heligoland and all other islands, in Schleswig-Holstein and in Denmark, to the Commander-in-Chief, 21st Army Group. Disobedience of orders or failure to comply with them will be regarded as a breach of these surrender terms and will be dealt with by the Allied powers in accordance with the accepted laws and usages of war. And the German delegation will now sign this paper, and they will sign in order of seniority, and General Admiral von Friedeberg will sign first.
Monty undoubtedly enjoyed the whole exercise, as you can imagine. I mean, the excitement of being commanding the army that was taking the surrender, and it was absolutely up his street.
General Kinsall will sign next.
And they were made to feel they were the underdogs, all right.
Rear Admiral Wagner will sign next.
Army signalers joyfully send out the news to their comrades all over Europe.
Colonel Lipscomb sent word to all the company commanders that the war is on the edge of, or nearly finished, so stand down, more or less, stand by. I felt empty, I felt numb, you know, at the suddenness of it. Although we expected it, it was so sudden, as he told us. And our senior sergeant, Sergeant Hanley, he took the platoon on one side. He said he wanted to give a little service. And I said, no, Tom, I said, I want to be on my own for 5 minutes. And I walked along the peat bog. There was a peat bog there, I'll always recall it, where the Germans had dug out, you know, batches of peat. And I walked along there about 50, 60, 70 yards, and I walked back again, thinking that the mates what I had left behind in France, Belgium and Holland.
As the armies on Montgomery's front ceased fire on May the 5th, the German General Staff sued for total surrender on all fronts.
General Eisenhower's battle headquarters in the ancient city of Rheims was the businesslike setting for Germany's unconditional surrender. And just before the delegates arrived, a few out of the millions of beaten German soldiers were trudging past the building.
Just as we arrived at the headquarters, a general, whom I assumed to be Jodl, arrived at the centre, and just as he arrived, absolutely immaculate, a file of very down-at-heel, scruffy German prisoners went by on street sweeping duty. And he didn't look at them, he walked straight into the centre.
Jodl arrived, a most elegant man with immense personal dignity, and the scene was formal. Jodl came, kept beautiful control of himself, signed and went away.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advent from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air. To every subordinate that has been in this command of almost 5 million allies, I owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid.
We thought that was the end of it, but of course it wasn't, because the Russians would not recognize a surrender either to Montgomery at Lüneburg or to the Allies as a whole at Rheims. They must be parties, and of course they were right, to the unconditional surrender, and they insisted, I think with great justification, that the unconditional surrender must be signed by the commanders-in-chief in Berlin.
But the Germans had surrendered. To keep the Russians happy, it was agreed the news should be kept secret for a day, but the message to our troops to stop fighting went out immediately.
I was chasing up a signal that had gone astray, and an American runner came in with a message in his hand. Didn't say anything, he stood there chewing his gum, and just stood there casually, didn't say a word. So I carried on with what I was doing, and after a few minutes turned to him, took the signal from him, glanced casually at it, and then realised what it was, that it was the ceasefire signal that everybody had been waiting for.
A message was coming through in plain language and double spacing, which was only used on very rare occasions. And all I could hear was, it's over, it's over. The girls were crowding round. They couldn't see the message. I couldn't get anywhere near. I'm not very tall. And several of the girls had climbed onto the solid steel tables. And the poor girl who was receiving the message, she just couldn't even see it. And the shouting and all the... There's something you can't explain, really. You would really need to have been there to have fully appreciated the excitement of everybody. The fact that we had won the war was, like all messages that came through, a secret.
I came back to duty on Monday the 7th, and it was obvious that the end was upon us, and we heard that the unconditional surrender terms had been signed, but it still was not decided which day would be V.E.Day.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. No statement has been made about the Prime Minister's V.E.Day broadcast. No announcement has yet been made by SHAEF about the cessation of hostilities, but unconfirmed reports from correspondents say that the unconditional surrender of Germany to the Western Allies and Russia was signed in the early hours of this morning.
Britons, impatient for the official signal to celebrate, jumped the starting gun on Monday night when notice of capitulation waited upon Whitehall, Washington, and Moscow.
I took a turn around St. James's Park, and everybody was starting to celebrate. It was a very wonderful feeling of excitement, but nobody knew definitely yet. And then later in the evening, I was on duty for late duty that night, and when I went into the study at the annex, where he was most evenings for dictation, he looked up and he said, "Hello, Miss Leighton. Well, the war's over. You've played your part."
This is the BBC Home Service. We're interrupting programs to make the following announcement. It is understood that in accordance with arrangements between the three great powers, an official announcement will be broadcast by the Prime Minister at 3 o'clock tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon, the 8th of May. In view of this fact, tomorrow, Tuesday, will be treated as Victory in Europe Day and will be regarded as a holiday.
The first we knew about it was when the foreman come and he got a hold of the chain for blowing the buzzer. That was a signal that there was going to be an air raid. But when he just said to one or two, "Don't panic, stay where you are." And he just blew the buzzer this once, and he shouted as loud as he could above the noise of the machines. The war's ended.
The news came over, 3 little pips, and then this man's voice saying, I think it was Mr. Sharrock, that the Germans were signing the declaration of unconditional surrender. and that it would be national holiday the following day. The men, all the benches, you know, had steel tops, and they just started to hammer with a spanner or a hammer, whatever was handy, and it was all in rhythm. And as it went overhead the plane, everyone took it up, till by the time it got down to the bottom, it was absolutely deafening. And when I looked round at other people, men or women, girls, apprentices, whichever, they were all just like I was. Tears were raining down their faces. It was very emotional, and I think we really knew then that that was the last day of the war in Europe.
At dawn on May the 8th, Air Chief Marshal Tedder flew from Rheims with the German delegation headed by Field Marshal Keitel to sign the final act of surrender in Berlin.
I was the officer inside the airplane responsible for the custody of the 3 German chiefs of staff and their delivery on Tempelhof airfield to the Russians. They were extremely apprehensive. Keitel had with him a staff officer of the same age as myself. Later, I discovered he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford at the same time as I was an undergraduate, because he reminded me of that fact in English during the journey, which elicited a Russian protest that I was talking a language with the captives, which they didn't understand, so that ended that conversation. Berlin itself was a shambles. It was in smoke. I've never seen such destruction in my life.
Air Chief Marshal Tedder, Deputy Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, is seen inspecting a Russian Guard of Honor a few hours before the final act of unconditional surrender in Berlin.
Keitel's face when, in the full regalia of a German Field Marshal, he descended from the Royal Air Force Dakota, there to be handed over by me to the Russian officers who had arrived. One just thought the last time Keitel had been on Tempelhof, and probably the ring carpet was down, and he was strutting about as the head of the German Armed Forces. That was a moment, I think, of his greatest humiliation.
As at Rheims, so in Berlin, the ceremony was short but very sweet, brief but very much to the point.
Now, Marshal Zhukov certainly is one of the finest soldiers I have ever had the honor to meet. A charming man, very understanding and imaginative. I would imagine also a ruthless and vigorous soldier. We immediately were on terms with him. Lord Tedder got on extremely well with him, and a rapport built up. The signature was formal, dignified. Keitel maintaining his dignity and his magnificent appearance to the last. The other two, woebegone. I never was able to discover in myself any sympathy for the German Chiefs of Staff at all. It's difficult to recall it now, but I think, like many, many millions of our fellow citizens and allies, were very bitter against the Germans indeed.
Got up in the morning and I couldn't hardly eat my breakfast because I was so excited at going to the palace. We were trying to get a taxi, we couldn't get a taxi. I didn't think we were going to be there in time, did we?
A mounted policeman came along. He took us under his wing. He got us a taxi. Where from, I don't know, but he got us a taxi, and he more or less rode in front of the taxi to clear the crowd to get us to the palace. And we arrived in style at the palace in a taxi with a mounted policeman.
And everybody was cheering and singing, and oh, it was wonderful. And when we got to the palace gates, well, there was a girl out of the crowd shouting, "Hi, Margaret, hi, Margaret." And I thought, that's somebody that knows us, and it was Beryl Williams around here. She was an ATS, wasn't she?
I think there was every serviceman, every nationality under the sun was at the palace, you know. It was just a fight to get in there.
And then when we got in the palace, oh, it was beautiful. Oh, it was fantastic. And then we were waiting for the king, and he came, and he was fantastic.
When I seen the king and mounted the rostrum and faced the king, my first impression was, what struck my mind was that the king was very heavily made up. I often wondered, but then afterwards, when it was disclosed of his illness, I realized then why he was made up. I think he's put on a wonderful, brave face. I think he was suffering then.
Almost right up to the end, London and southern England had been under fire. London certainly had as much right as anywhere to celebrate victory, and London certainly did.
People everywhere. So the mounted police were brought in. We eventually got through a crowd of us. I think we got split up. And I am somewhere shouting, "Come on, George," and "Come on, George," you know. And the excitement was tremendous.
Seven times during V.E.Day, the British royal family appeared on the balcony. And the people below were the people of Britain, a people who for 5.5 long years had suffered under the bombs and guns of Nazi Germany.
I went along to Buckingham Palace, where there was an enormous throng already assembled all around the Victoria Memorial. So I got the trumpet out and I started to play, and people made a circle and started to dance, and musicians appeared out of the blue. There was a trombone player turned up, and a sailor who had what looked like the horn of one of those enormous old-fashioned gramophones, into which he sort of blew raspberries, and it made a sort of tuba sound. And there were various sort of people with percussion things, and so we got a small band together. It was a colossal atmosphere, the royal family coming out, you know, not once, but over and over and over again. And because everybody was united in one huge sort of surge of relief.
Well, the crowd, I can watch them up the mall. They're pouring into this great space in front of the forecourt, and there's a trumpet playing now somewhere down below me, and as the crowd swirls, eddies, and waits, we must take our last look at this wonderful scene.
Just after lunch, the BBC came to number 10 and they set up the microphones and all the necessary equipment in the cabinet room.
Now from London.
And first of all, I remember we heard a loud trumpeting sound as Mr. Churchill blew his nose, and then we heard him giving instructions to the BBC technicians. Move the speaker a little closer, please. No, don't stand there. Move it away a little farther, please. And then he was on the air.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day.
But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance, Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
I think you just had, it was a thing you had to share because it was over, it was finally over, and you had to share this experience with people. You
But
had
it was
to
such
be
an
with them.
enormous crowd. You know how sometimes in an enormous crowd you feel, oh my God, you know, it's frightening because people might get angry or... But there was no feeling of that at all.
Not at all. There was never a moment of fear. And I can still remember
we were doing
all
the
grabbing.
conga. It was hard to hang on to the people in the front.
Yes, that's right. Yes, you do remember one of our friends got pulled back and her blouse was split completely. Where did she go after that? I don't remember.
American Army bands play British and American songs of two wars.
We must have done Leicester Square, and we'd come round all of Leicester Square then, and there were two American officers about 4 stories up who were pouring bottles of whiskey down on the crowd. That was their celebration. They were giving up their precious whiskey.
I don't know who was underneath, because there had to be lots of people.
Yes. Getting splashed. I doubt anyone was like that. Anyway. Oh, yes, the sailors
Remember
that went right
them
up
way
there.
up the lamppost.
That's
They were
right.
really up high.
Yeah, I remember wondering how on earth did they get there? Somebody
I don't
must have bunked
know.
them up.
Somebody, they had to
because you
stand
can't
on somebody
exactly
else's
climb.
shoulder.
Yes, that's probably. It was a determination, either that or to get out of the crowd. I mean, it was history, wasn't it? We weren't aware of it at the time. We were just having a good time. That's right, yes.
One of the most moving scenes of the many on V.E.Day was in Whitehall, when the Prime Minister unexpectedly spoke to the crowds assembled to cheer him.
Your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. God bless you all.
We couldn't hear the crowds from where we were in the annex, but when I got on the balcony, I couldn't believe all these people. I couldn't believe this roaring. It almost seemed to sort of come up and lift you off your feet. I think it gave him a great thrill that when he went out in the car, people pressed round and just to touch his car and shouted and made such a fuss. He'd never had that kind of acclamation before. And so I think V.E. Day was a very special time for him too.
Back to Buckingham Palace, where this time Churchill was to stand on the famous balcony with the royal family, to share with them a nation's joy.
But as Churchill drove through London, as he received the adulation of the crowds, he knew well enough that the victory was not as straightforward as it seemed. The problems of peace in Europe were already beginning to make themselves felt.
Well, while all the fireworks are going off and all the rejoicing was taking place, there were one or two very serious worries. To begin with, Marshal Tito had moved his victorious partisans towards Trieste. He even announced he'd taken it, though he hadn't, and Venezia Giulia in the north of Italy, and into Carinthia, which was Austrian, and it looked as if he wished, as I'm sure he did, to seize those three places. Now, that would have meant a clash, a real, probably a military clash, with General Alexander's troops in the north of Italy, so that we would have been fighting our own allies just at the time when we'd finished fighting the Germans. And then there was a second, equally alarming possibility that we might find ourselves fighting the French, because General de Gaulle, without so much as telling anybody, sent off a ship full of troops to Syria, where the local people were in rebellion because they had been promised by de Gaulle independence, and that independence had been guaranteed by the British, and now they were demanding it and the French were suppressing it. And so de Gaulle sent off a whole shipload of troops, and Churchill warned him directly that that would almost certainly mean a clash between British troops and French troops in the Middle East.
Our most pleasant duty for the Premier was the visiting of the ambassadors of our allies, first of all, France. The American ambassador, Mr. Wynant, gives a warm welcome to the Premier, who was accompanied by his daughter Mary.
By far the greatest worry for the Western Allies was Soviet intentions. The Russians had just liberated Poland, but would they hold free elections as they'd promised? And how would we get on with them after the war?
At the Russian embassy, Mr. Gusiev receives the good wishes of a staunch friend of the peoples of the Soviet Union.
Now, the whole of the United Kingdom and of the United States were all looking upon the Russians as the great heroes. Churchill doubted whether they really were going to remain like that after the war.
The main objective, as we understood it from a briefing we had previously, was to reach Wismar before the Russians got there, because it was felt that if they got to Wismar, they would then probably get to Kiel. So one can take it, I think, that the objective really was to get to somewhere before our allies got there. At what speed, in fact, we were able to attain, I don't know, but I suppose around about 25 miles an hour, something of that sort, which is pretty fast for a fairly heavy tank like a Sherman's, which is what we had. The Germans were coming in ever-increasing numbers. I mean, a flood of Germans, many of whom were still armed, pointing and saying, Ruskies, Ruskies, behind them. So they were fleeing in large numbers from our allies, obviously.
The incredible thing was the shouts of good cheer and encouragement that came to us from our ex-enemies. There we were fighting them a few days before, and here suddenly they were almost patting us on the back and pointing to the east and said, he's there, Tommy, Tommy, go, run east, go. As if we were then going to take over their great mission of controlling the Red Menace. And of course, we did get there. We got to Wismar about 20 minutes before, and we went tearing eastward along the road, and suddenly, ahead of us, coming towards us, there was another make of half-track vehicle. And in it, we pulled up, and they were the Russians, of course. And the ones we hit seemed to have come from Mongolia or something. At least they seemed to us to have. But charmers. And they were full of bottles. They were looted all the way along. And we had some too. And we started talking and slapping. You couldn't understand a word we were saying. There we were in the middle of the road, slapping each other on the back and said, dummy and Ivan, or whatever we could think of.
How do you do? How you found Joe Stalin's soldiers, and I'm pleased to meet you. We've both come a long way together. And we've done a
Красная армия очень довольна тем, что наши союзники также били врага, как и мы.
What does that mean, Colin? Very good.
What does that mean?
Eh?
What does that mean?
How do I know?
How do I?
Well, we can't linger, but we can fight the same way together, can't we?
Yes.
Well,
All the best, old man. I'm very, very glad to have met you. Very glad indeed. Благодарим вас за помощь, которую оказали вы нам в войне против гитлеровской Германии.
Thank you very much. We don't understand the language, but we mean the same thing.
So we slapped each other on the back, as I remember, and congratulated each other that we had met that particular point. And then I suppose they were, I think their tanks were called T-34s, but anyhow, we were interested, one tank man, as it were, to another, to see inside. And that was denied to us. Whether it was just initial apprehension, well, we don't know what these English are like or British are like, and or whether it was policy that when you do meet the Allies, where they are, they're not to see what we've got.
We were getting on famously, and then another much more formal car arrived, and in it there were officers, and things then took on a more formal note, and they shook us, how polite, and shook us by the hand, but the men stepped back, and more people came up. And by the afternoon, they had put a pole across the road. And so I reckon I saw, before my very eyes, the first clang of the iron curtain coming down. Strange feeling.
The link-up between the Americans and the Russians at the River Elbe near Torgau marked the climax of the two great advances into the heart of Germany from west and east. And this is how Major General Reinhardt and his staff crossed the river. Somebody called it the Elbe Regatta.
The conflict between soldierly friendship and political tension was especially clear to British prisoners of war who'd been freed by the Russians.
We found that already there was a confrontation between the Americans and the Russians, and we weren't allowed to cross. And we were told that it was going to take about 10 days to 3 weeks before we got permission to go westward, home. So 3 of my friends and I, who was in the camp, we decided that we weren't going to hang around for this. We'd make our way eastwards and probably go to Moscow and fly back from there, Russians being our allies. The night before V.E.Day, we were in Poland and we spent the night with some Russian troops. They were a tank company and in their headquarters. And we had a very good time. Knocked back a few vodkas, and we was woken next morning by a Russian dashing in, waving his arms, shouting to the top of his voice, "Koniec, koniec," which means Russian, finished. So we knew it was the end of the war. So out come the vodka, and we steadily managed to put a few away, you know. And finally, about an hour later, we had our breakfast, which was a damn great big black iron stew pot and full of potatoes and onions and anything that could be scrounged from the countryside. And I'm pretty certain there was 1 or 2 dead dogs in there, because I don't think there was any other meat around. The countryside had been stripped, you know. So it was stew and vodka. Pretty deadly combination, actually. And that's my V.E.Day in Europe.
Hello, BBC. This is Winford Vaughan Thomas reporting to you from Germany. This is V.E.Day in Germany. And here in the old town of Lüneburg, we're standing in the main square where the Germans have assembled. They've been told to assemble by loudspeaker to listen to an important announcement, and now they stand before the old town hall in a docile crowd.
People of Lüneburg, the Nazi government and the German Wehrmacht has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied Expeditionary Forces.
Surrender, abject surrender, was all in the air in Germany. It was as if we were talking to people like zombies walking in a dream, and the dream suddenly was over. They hadn't really thought that the Reich was going to collapse. They'd listened to Goebbels, they were listening to Hitler even. And the absolute impregnable conviction that the Third Reich was going to continue 1,000 years was still there in their minds.
Europe has been brought to misery and famine by Germany. The German nation must not expect to fare better than the nations they have overrun.
And at the end of it, they turned and they went away.
I lived outside Schwerin, and I got down into the butcher's queue at 6 o'clock in the morning. A little while after that, a woman joined the queue and gave us, well, to me, the very sad news that a man had been hanged by the SS just on a lamppost outside the town hall because he'd been blabbing against Hitler. And, of course, if he'd kept his mouth shut for another 2 hours, he'd have lived his life to the end in the natural way.
First, I knew I would become prisoner. How long? What was going to happen in Germany? No idea. Then I had to come to terms with myself. What are you doing now? What's going to happen to you now? No contact with relations, without any moral support whatsoever. And then I came to think about the past, about the war, the years, thinking of my comrades with whom we went out, how few came back, and that they all had lost their lives thinking they were fighting and dying for a just and noble cause, for the future of Germany. And now we stood practically in front of the ruins of them, without future, without everything. What was it worth to live for?
I expected the Germans to be happy as well because the load had been lifted from their shoulders, but it wasn't, because before you could still hope for some sort of survival from the shooting, from the bombing or anything, and it was like a death warrant. I kept jumping about saying, peace, 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 and everybody said, shut up, quiet. This is not peace, it's an armistice. And there was this general feeling of terrible gloom. When they came and took over our house, they locked us all in different cellars. They took over the main cellar and starved us. We couldn't get out. So finally, after 3 days, my aunt, who spoke a bit of Polish, she pushed me forward into the cellar full of reveling Russians and said in Polish, did they have a little bit of food for a little girl? And they produced a good big pot of which 9 people could eat happily, and it was there and then that I realized looking pathetic was the most important thing for me and for me to survive.
Here is the other side of the picture. We, in British uniforms, can imagine a different V.E.Day, V.E.Day in Britain. We can picture your excitement and the cheering and the flags.
There was all this yelling. So we must have
even just stop for a minute yourself and hear that noise.
Yes, that's right.
And it was such a together feeling. That's what I liked about it.
Yes. Yes, we'd all won it together, and I think that was really what it was, yes.
Wherever you went, you didn't get very far, and they were all nationalities, and I was in the okey-cokey and the conga, and I got lifted off my feet and carried several yards, and I was terrified. I couldn't feel any ground underneath me.
It was every sort of festive occasion, boat race night and Derby Day and everything else rolled into one.
Oh gosh, I was grabbed. I was grabbed in all places. And it was just one mad hugging and kissing, grabbing you all over. You didn't know who it was, and everybody was kissing, turning round, and somebody pulling you one way, and you were joining in. It was the most tremendous occasion that I can remember. Really, it was. You'd have to go really live through it to fully understand and appreciate just what a wonderful time it was.
That's the far end of Oscar Road.
Yes, that's
right. Yes.
There's me sitting there. Where? Next to Pauline, sitting down there.
No. They look on the end here, man.
That's not me.
Mrs. Kennedy.
You missed it, Bella.
Remember that?
That's me, Bella.
What's
this, Fleming Street?
This is Fleming Street.
Well, everybody was out in the streets. You wanted to see everybody, and you wanted to be able to laugh and cry and do everything. You know, it was a wonderful thing.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, it's a happy day.
Us together and decided that we'll have a party, and so the food all came out, and it was beautiful.
That's
me in the middle, looking behind that pink paper hat there.
The shops, they all helped. The corner shop, Mrs. Craig and Mr. Lana here, they all helped, you know, give a bit of stuff and that, but make the tea for the bairns, and they all enjoyed it. So Mrs. Kennedy brought a piano out, and playing the piano and was dancing in the street. And
you were dashing all over the place, and you were looking for somebody, and you wanted to talk to them, and it was a fantastic thing, really.
The way I've been thinking about it now, it reminded me of when they used to send the pigeons away to Selby, or even to the north of France, and they were all kept in their baskets, and they were all liberated at once. And there's such a flutter of wings and squawking and chirping and what have you. They were pleased to be released from their prison, as it were, you know. And to me, on V.E.Day, that was just what the people felt like.
Some of the best news coming out of Germany today is the release of more and more prisoners of war. Stalag 11B, which held about 6,500 men, was liberated by the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats.
Well, for a moment or two, I was emotionally drained. I couldn't move. I couldn't believe it. We just looked at each other with in sheer disbelief, and when the realization that we had been liberated and that we were safely behind our own fellas, we just a lot of myself included, just broke down and cried and shook our hands, and then the strength started to come back, and an absolute feeling of ecstasy. We just raced over to the wire, and we were little schoolboys. It was an unbelievable feeling.
Everybody went wild around the camp, went flying out the gates, seeing what they could grab, what they could find, what food they could get, what they could loot. There was several warehouses around the camp. Some had grain in, some had masses of cheap, shoddy goods such as cigarette lighters, pipes, eau de cologne. The eau de cologne, we brought a lot of that, but we went back to get some more, and a lot of these Ukrainians, I think they were, had been in and they got drunk on it. And they came back into the camp, and they were the nicest smelling drunks I'd ever seen.
It was a funny experience. We went to an aerodrome, and there were a lot of Lancasters, which promised to be rather thrilling, because one had never been up in a Lancaster or anything like that. And somebody said, "Come over quickly to the NAFI, we've got some coffee here, and Churchill's about to come on the radio." So we went and had our coffee and heard his speech, and it was lovely. It was marvelous to hear his voice again, and to hear English spoken outside, you know. We were slowly, I think, coming round from the anaesthetic. If you were lucky enough to be in the first flight, you get first away. And so the only way to settle that seemed to be to play a hand of poker. And this is incredible. It's the only time in the whole of my life I've ever had a winning hand at poker or any other game. But my cards came up, and I was one of the few to be on the first lot. We were loaded into the bomb bay. I don't know how, there were many of us. And the airplane took off. And at some point, I think he's called the midships gunner, something like that, a very nice chap, poked his head down. He said to me, "Would you like to come and have a look at the view from the midships turret?" So I thought, terrific. And I went up into the turret, and there down below were the white cliffs of Dover. Funny enough, I know it's terribly corny, but I really did feel terribly moved. I think I cried a bit. Very soon afterwards, we landed at an aerodrome near Horsham. And stepping off the airplane, I remember being greeted by an absolutely enormous Red Cross woman. And I thought, this is nice, reception committee. So I held out my hand to shake hers, and she promptly produced an extraordinary gun and covered me from head to foot with delousing powder.
Each prisoner had a waff as a reception, part of the reception part. And of course, I had to finish up with one about 6'7", I think. A very nice waff house, and me being just about 5'6".
No, we didn't want to look forward to V.E.Day at all. It was a very selfish attitude, but you all more or less felt, oh, let it go on forever. Don't let it end. We didn't want to face up to the future, which, of course, we had to do. My father was the best one, really. He was the one that took us, Marjorie and I, out to get away from the home. But then, of course, we were always up against people, a lot of people enjoying themselves. My father took us for a drink, but that we didn't stay long because we just couldn't stand the merriment of people.
I just wanted to get away, and where they lived, it was surrounded in fields, and there was this lovely pond in this field, and I spent the best part of the day sitting beside that pond, just reminiscing of all the lovely times we had together, and couldn't believe that I wouldn't have those times again. And I thought that, oh dear, I've got to get on with this on my own now.
And my sort of feelings were, oh dear, it's all over. What am I going to do now? Everybody will be coming back. Everybody will be happy. You could live while the war was on because other people's husbands were away and they were really in the same position as you were. But the fact that the war was over and life was going to return to normal was far away from my thoughts.
And let us remember those
who will not come back. Their constancy and courage in battle, their sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. Let us remember the men in all the services, and the women in all of the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing. Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome. In the Far East, we have yet to deal with the Japanese, a determined and cruel foe. To this we shall turn with the utmost resolve and with all our resources.
We knew the war in Europe was going pretty well, but we were actually surprised when the radio operator came around about 10 o'clock in the morning and said the war in Europe was over. And we didn't know whether to believe him or what. But a little later on, the company commander called us all together and he confirmed that it was over.
When we heard that the war was over in England, I remember someone very distinctly saying, "Oh, bully for England." And because the Japs was throwing everything at us that they had at that time, he screamed out, "Has anyone told these yellow bastards that?" And it seemed as though the Japanese had no intention whatsoever of letting us go home to celebrate the victory. I'm assuming they knew the war was over. I don't know if they did or not. But it certainly seemed as though they, you know, we was going to stay there where so many more of my people did.
However, a runner told me to get a section together to move off within the hour, as a party of Japs had been seen heading that way, and it was our job to deal with them, which we did. And when I got back, I thought, well, those lads in Europe, with all the girls in the villages turning out to cheer them on, I said, here we are, stuck in a rain-sodden paddy field. What a contrast.
But even as in the final days, the troops were enjoying tumultuous receptions in the liberated cities and towns of Northern Europe. They were also uncovering horrors which completely changed their attitudes to the war.
I was intelligence officer for the 5th Reconnaissance Regiment. And I was working, of course, with the colonel of the regiment, who was a rather shy, brave man. And he decided that he and I should go swanning off in an armoured car and see really what was going on. And we came to a small town called Neustadt. And I remember vividly driving up in this small armoured car to the town square. And there was a very strange atmosphere. People were kind of running around. Usually when one arrived, it was always quiet, but there was a certain kind of running around going on. And I spotted on the far side of the square quite a number of people dressed in pajamas, which it didn't register at the time. And then a woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, you must stop these people. They are political criminals and they're stealing things," which again I didn't understand. And then when I looked again at these pajama figures, I realized this was the concentration camp uniform. We came to a huge hangar and I had this young boy with me as well, who was really a kind of guide. He was about 14, I think. And we went into this hangar, which was completely black and in darkness. And one just had a sense of size, and one had a sense of smell of people. but one couldn't have any idea how many. Gradually one became accustomed to the darkness, and I found a box, and I stood on this box, and I said, the British have arrived. Your worries are over. We will get you food. We will get you medical attention. Most people were on the ground. And after I had said these few words, there was a silence. I had expected some response. There seemed to be just numbness, no response at all. And then suddenly, from the sort of back of the room, came the thinnest kind of cheer. It was a cheer of no strength, but it was deeply moving, and I found myself with tears running down my cheeks. And anyhow, that's really what we did. We spent the next 72 hours. Everyone was called to help, and we set up food, medical attention. The next morning, we asked everybody from this hangar to come out onto the kind of pitch, green pitch in front of the hangar. And of the several thousand that were there, some came out, and the rest were either too weak to move or were already dead. There were a lot of people all roped together and tied together and just shot, but their heads had been clubbed in and eyes were on the sand. And there was a great pile of bodies. I think later we counted 36 dead bodies. And under this pile, there was one young girl still alive. And, well, at least when we left, she was still alive. I hope she did survive. But these sights were such that they're just indelibly on one's mind. And I think really this is one of the very few occasions I've spoken of it since, because one simply can't live with it outwardly. You just have to bury these experiences. And we pulled out and we went to Travemünde, which was a nearby resort. And we took over a hotel, and there was a kind of officers' mess. And I can remember the radio telling us that the war was over. And we sat there in silence, I remember. I can remember just sitting back in this chair and hearing this news, and nobody reacting.
I, as a Member of Parliament, with 9 others, visited Buchenwald concentration camp. Some people believe that the reports of what happened there are exaggerated. No words could exaggerate. We saw and we know. We were able to speak freely with internees and to hear their stories. You will now see a few of the sights we saw, and much as they may shock you, do believe me when I tell you that the reality was indescribably worse than these pictures. You cannot photograph suffering, only its results. In pictures you have no smell of disease and death. Here you see no more than a fragment of the full pattern of horror. On the day before our visit, the deaths had been reduced to 35 during the day. Several nationalities and types, many of them intellectual and highly gifted men and women, were herd in unspeakable conditions which have entirely altered their appearance.
Well, the camp, when we got there, was full of these wandering prisoners in their blue and white striped uniform, gaunt and emaciated. And the ones who were not being looked after in hospital used to wander around looking for scraps. And they often used to squat down by the roadside. And there was something very sinister about them. Although they were unfortunate, they used to squat down and beg. And my first reaction, I found myself shuddering away from them. Well, the Nazi aim had been to degrade, especially these Slavonic peoples like the Poles and Jews, so that they were lower than human beings. That was the point of the system. And I was falling in with the Nazi philosophy by shuddering away
because people who have been degraded and made inhuman are not lovable people. And I think that's a very important thing I've thought of ever since.
Medical authorities on the spot estimate that people will still be dying at least a year from now as a direct result of having been inmates of Belsen. The people of Germany are being compelled to see the horror films that were taken there. In Minden, for example, we see them entering a cinema under compulsion. Inside, they see what the British public have seen. And if any are not sickened with shame, they are indeed beyond redemption.
We were forced to see it, and I think most of us didn't believe in it. We all thought that was especially a film to prepare us for what was going to come on us, yes. And justifying all the things because of our criminal misdeeds, yes.
Some people just started laughing. So it's silly, it must be something from India or drought or people dying. And it took a long time to sink in.
People left the hut that you were shown in, they just walked away. There was hardly anything said, and the reaction didn't actually set in till much later. Then great discussion started among prisoners, where they said, now how on earth can anything like that happen in a civilized country? I mean, how do we now stand? We are going to be the baddies for this century. Nobody ever will trust us.
Personally, I didn't believe at first. It took me a couple of days to really, before I really thought it was true. And then I felt sick, physically sick, because I'd never have believed that something like that could happen. But there you are. And from there, it wasn't easy to believe in anything anymore.
This mass race elimination theory, the whole of the Nazi philosophy, you might say, rendered this war specifically horrible to most of us. You were no longer dealing with the good German people, or even if you were at war with them in the First World War, you could have sympathy, you could understand. In this was suddenly, you were confronted with a theory of the elimination of elements out of humanity, and you had to fight it.
We knew that we had defeated an enemy in a bitter battle at a bitter cost, and the only satisfaction of victory was that the enemy's ideology had been bust forever and thrown onto the dust heap. There was no other satisfaction in victory. I can remember Armistice Day 1918. That was indeed a cheerful day. We had, so to speak, won an extremely unpleasant and dirtily played rugby football match. But that wasn't the attitude on the 8th of May 1945. We had survived, and our values had survived just.
In the days when war seems remote and far away, these will be historic pictures. They will tell another generation how England celebrated victory in Europe Day.
A kiss won't mean goodbye, but hello to love. When the lights go on again, all over the world, ships will sail again all over the world. Then we'll have time for things like wedding rings and free hearts.
Lyttleton. It was looking out